Welcome to our next session. Today, we're diving into one of the most important and often most controversial parts of gifted education, how we identify gifted students. We'll also explore the challenges of equity, especially for culturally diverse and economically disadvantaged students who are often overlooked. These two chapters together help us see both the how of identification as well as the who of identification. This lecture is going to coordinate with chapters 3 and 13 of Education of the Gifted and Talented. So you're definitely going to want to make sure that you complete the reading for this that accompanies this module. And of course, make sure that you check that learning system for any activities or supplements or assignments that would be associated. All right, let's go ahead and jump into characteristics of gifted individuals, identifying gifted students, and equity in gifted education. Identification is the gateway to services. If we don't identify a student as gifted, they don't receive the instruction and supports they need. Today, we'll review common identification tools and processes, then focus on the barriers that lead to underrepresentation. We'll close by thinking critically about how we, as educators, can make the process more equitable. The identification process isn't just a label, it's a key to opportunity. In Louisiana, identification also determines whether a student will have an IEP for giftedness. Without being identified, students may coast academically, disengage, or even participate in what we call that underachievement or underperformance. Identification also impacts long-term pathways, access to advanced classes, scholarships, and leadership opportunities. That's why accuracy and fairness in identification are so critical. So identification matters because it opens the door to services. It prevents or can enhance prevention of underachievement. And it also shapes access to future opportunities. Schools use a variety of tools to identify gifted students. Standardized tests are the most common. Ability tests like IQ measures and achievement tests. Teacher and parent nominations are also widely used, but they can be biased. Performance tasks and portfolios allow students to demonstrate creativity and problem solving in more authentic ways. Observation and rating skills can capture behaviors not shown in tests. Ideally, schools use multiple measures to build a fuller picture. You will have an opportunity here at McNeese State University in your gifted certification courses to look specifically at your district's methods for identifying gifted students. Even in the state of Louisiana, there are certain standards that must be and criteria for identification systems that must be met. But there is variability from district to district on how students are identified. So let's just take a moment to appreciate this cartoon regarding a student's frustration with identification. I can start putting up my nose and blow it out the corner of my eye, but they still won't put me in the gifted class at school. I think that this really highlights not only the student's frustration, but also the different ways that sometimes we assess giftedness. Identification isn't perfect. Over-reliance on test scores tends to favor students with strong test-taking skills, and of course, those from advantaged backgrounds who have more access to study prep materials, tutors, and just a general atmosphere of supporting test success. Teacher bias, even unconscious and implicit biases, can lead to overlooking students who don't fit the stereotype of giftedness. Students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds may not perform well on tests written from a majority culture perspective. And limited access to preschool or enrichment means that some students never get a chance to demonstrate advanced potential. So these can definitely limit access to identification to begin with. And of course, we know that if they're not identified, many times they are simply not going to receive the services that they deserve. Chapter 13 calls these students the invisible gifted. They exist in every school, but many of them never get identified. Research shows a consistent underrepresentation of students of color, English learners, and those from low-income backgrounds in gifted programs nationwide. We call this a disproportionate and underrepresentation. This underrepresentation is not because they lack ability. It's because the system often fails to recognize their talents. As your textbook mentions, and as you may even see within the district that you're currently serving in, or maybe will serve in the future, there are programs put into place to serve specifically what we consider the underrepresented populations. It's to help them prepare for testing materials, increase the likelihood that we are going to correctly identify students who deserve to receive gifted services. They oftentimes have different acronyms like REACH or RISE. And the whole point is to tap into who those students could potentially be and essentially provide some equity in helping them prepare for the identification process. Doesn't mean that we teach to the test, but it simply means that we're leveling the playing field of perhaps providing them resources that other students had access to that they didn't. And so this is a measure to eliminate or minimize some of the disproportionate representation, misrepresentation that we have. So while we are on that subject, let's go ahead and talk about why they're overlooked. How do we miss these students? First, testing instruments are often normed on majority populations. It disadvantages those who don't fit that majority norm. Second, cultural differences shape how giftedness is expressed. For example, some students may show creativity in oral storytelling rather than written work. Teachers may not have training to recognize gifted traits in diverse learners. And finally, stereotypes and deficit thinking can blind educators to strengths in students that they perceive as struggling. So these are some things that sometimes cloud our vision as teachers, and it's again why we overlook these students who should at least have an opportunity to be tested for gifted. So let's talk a little bit more about the invisible gifted. As we mentioned, it's highlighted in the reading for this particular module, and these are students who are simply never identified. As we mentioned, underrepresentation is especially high among the students of color, English learners, and those from low-income backgrounds. So national research and professional guidance can provide some strategies to help minimize or mitigate some of these inequities. Notice that the NAGC Equity and Diversity Resources have some fantastic materials. They help emphasize multiple criteria for identification, culturally responsive practices, and ongoing teacher training. So part of your assignments for this course may involve you digging into some of these resources. As I mentioned, the NAGC resource might be a good one for you. Another one is the Ford resource. It outlines practical strategies for recruiting and retaining underrepresented gifted students, including universal screening, portfolio assessments, and mentorships programs. By integrating this national context, participants participants in these types of programs can actually see how not only are these students underrepresented in gifted programming, but oftentimes even when they are identified, when they get into the gifted programming, the services may not match their needs. So that's why I represent these, I recommend these resources. I think for this course, it might be appropriate considering the case study that you're going to have to do. These could be a nice pairing depending on the subject that you choose for the case study. To make identification more equitable, which kind of goes along with the last slide, we need to expand how we look for giftedness. Multiple measures reduce the risk of bias. Teacher training is essential, and not just for teachers of gifted, all teachers, everyone in our school staff. You know, we receive quite a bit on English language learners, and we receive quite a bit to support our special education students. But this is definitely an area that's lacking when it comes to professional development. So teacher training is essential so that educators can learn to see gifted potential in different cultural contexts. We also need to be aware that gifted students sometimes underachieve when the classroom doesn't fit their needs. And this is something I mentioned in the last slide, even when they're identified. Finally, partnering with families helps reveal talents that may not show up in school tests or assignments. In fact, we know that many stakeholders, parents, community members, grandparents of these underrepresented populations oftentimes don't even realize that these programs are available in their schools. So they don't even know to advocate for these resources for their students. In Louisiana, so we always want to focus a bit on our state. Once a student is identified as gifted, they qualify for services through an IEP. We mentioned this in the last module. This makes Louisiana distinctive. The identification process typically involves standardized testing plus additional criteria set by the state. Importantly, once a student is identified, schools are legally required to provide individualized services. This raises the stakes for equitable identification because if a student isn't identified, they miss out on that services that they're entitled to by law. I also want you to think about the underlying issue that might be happening in Louisiana. Because we do have this very important policy in place that provides IEP services to students who are identified as gifted. Imagine if you have a district that's already understaffed, if you have one that's already under-resourced or underfunded, they might not be as inclined to promote training and identification of giftedness because then they would be legally obligated to provide the services to those students. So this is something that's often not talked about. It's an understudied area. And I want you to think about if in those school systems where they already may be understaffed, underfunded, it might not necessarily be in the district's best interest to promote identification across the board, not just of underrepresented students, but of all students. So this might not be something that's said or stated, but it might simply be one of those unwritten drivers and those unwritten factors that can create underrepresentation and just under-identification in general in our schools. So let's talk a little bit more about the Louisiana context. In Louisiana, gifted students receive those services through the IEP, as we mentioned, and identification is critical. The process usually involves, as we stated before, a standardized test and some additional criteria. So here are some key resources that you may want to become familiar with, especially considering the assignments that you're going to have to do for this course and your future gifted courses. But the Louisiana Department of Education has an entire section of gifted and talented guidance. These outline the identification procedures, program requirements, and IEP forms specific to our state. So as I mentioned, each district may have, a slightly different way or slightly different tools that they use for identification, but the state has some very strong criteria in place that all districts have to abide by. The next resource is the National Association of Gifted Children's Equity and Diversity in Gifted Education Resources. These provide strategies for recognizing and serving underrepresented gifted students, including culturally and linguistically diverse learners. I find that this resource is just helpful for all students in general, whether or not they are economically disadvantaged or students of color. The NAGC resources are just really great to help us understand the identification process and how we can look for all gifted learners in all of our classrooms, in all of our school settings. So again, I just mentioned these two resources as potential areas that you might be able to find some answers or some more understanding, especially given the case study that you're going to have to do for this course. So now let's take just a moment and consider this case example. Consider a student who is an English learner. In class, the student consistently demonstrates creative problem solving and advanced reasoning, but the student scores poorly on tests that rely heavily on language skills. In many states, this student might not be identified. In Louisiana, the IEP system could allow us to build in multiple measures, such as performance tasks, teacher observations, or nonverbal assessments to fairly capture this student's strengths. This student's IEP could then include goals that both challenge them academically and support English language development. So this particular case shows how equity and state policy intersect, why we need to think broadly about identification, and see how identification is really the first step in ensuring that we're meeting the needs of the whole student. To summarize, identification is the gateway to gifted services. Without it, students remain unsupported. Bias in testing, teacher referrals, and cultural perceptions often create invisible gifted students who never get the services they deserve. Louisiana's IEP system makes this even more important because once identified, gifted students have legal rights to services. That means teachers must serve as advocates, pushing for fair and equitable identification practices. Let's close with a little bit of reflection. Think about your own classrooms, your schools, your districts, maybe those that you actually attended as a student. Have you seen a student you believed was gifted, but who was not identified? Why do you think that happened? What role did tests, bias, or opportunity play? And most importantly, how could you now, in this new role as a gifted teacher, advocate for that student within the IEP system? This discussion connects today's theory, hopefully, to your lived experience and prepares you to become an equity-focused educator who advocates for the rights of all students, particularly those who you believe may not be receiving services as a gifted student because they have never been identified. So please make sure that you check out the remaining resources for this module. You're going to have some assignments, perhaps some tasks to take care of, additional reading, and there might even be some supplements available to you. If you have any questions, reach out to your instructor and have a wonderful week. Continue serving our students and leading with love.